We've all seen those grainy black and white photos of soldiers standing in muddy trenches. But have you ever wondered what it was really like to live and fight in those death traps for months on end? The reality was far more horrific than any history textbook could ever capture. What I'm about to tell you will completely change how you think about the Great War and the men who fought in those hellish conditions. These aren't the sanitized facts you learned in school. These are the brutal truths that reveal just how nightmarish trench warfare really was. Most people think they understand World War I trench warfare. You dig a hole, you shoot at the enemy, and you try not to get shot back. But that's like saying surgery is just cutting people open with a knife. The actual reality was a complex, terrifying system that turned entire landscapes into industrial killing machines where death could come from directions you'd never expect. Before we dive into the 10 things that will shock you about trench warfare, let me give you some context that will make everything else make perfect sense. The Western Front stretched for over 400 miles from the North Sea to the Swiss border. But this wasn't just one line of trenches facing another. What developed was actually a massive underground city system that housed millions of men in conditions that would make medieval dungeons look comfortable. The first thing you need to understand is that trenches weren't straight lines. Military engineers quickly learned that if you dug trenches in straight lines, enemy artillery could fire down the entire length and kill everyone inside with a single shell. So they developed a zigzag pattern called a traverse system. Every few yards, the trench would make a sharp turn. This meant that even if a shell landed directly in the trench, the blast would only affect a small section. But here's what nobody tells you about this design. It created hundreds of blind corners where soldiers could be ambushed by their own side in the dark. Friendly fire incidents were disturbingly common because you literally couldn't see who was coming around the next corner. The second horrifying reality was the smell. Imagine the worst odor you've ever encountered, then multiply it by 1,000. The trenches reeked of human waste, rotting corpses, poison gas residue, and something soldiers called the sweet stench of gangrene. Men would vomit from the smell alone before they even saw their first battle. The human nose can supposedly get used to any odor, but soldiers wrote letters home describing how the smell would wake them from sleep and follow them into their dreams. Third, and this will make your skin crawl, the trenches were absolutely infested with rats. But these weren't ordinary rats. They were massive creatures, some as big as cats, that had grown fat feeding on human corpses scattered across no man's land. These rats would crawl over sleeping soldiers at night, steal food right from their hands, and some were so bold they would attack wounded men who couldn't fight them off. Soldiers would wake up to find rat bites on their faces and hands. The fourth nightmare was something called trench foot. This wasn't just getting your feet wet. Imagine standing in cold, contaminated water mixed with urine and decomposing flesh for weeks at a time. The constant moisture would cause your skin to literally rot off your feet. Soldiers would remove their boots to find their toes had turned black and were falling off. In severe cases, entire feet would have to be amputated. The worst part was that it was completely preventable. But there simply wasn't enough dry space or time for proper foot care. Fifth, the psychological warfare was more brutal than any physical weapon. Both sides would use techniques designed to drive the enemy insane. They would play recordings of dying soldiers screaming through loudspeakers at night. They would fire just one shot every few minutes at random intervals to keep everyone on edge. Some units would drag metal objects across the ground to create scraping sounds that would make soldiers think the enemy was digging tunnels underneath them. The sixth terrifying aspect was the weather itself became a weapon. Rain would fill trenches with water up to a man's chest. In winter, soldiers would freeze to death standing upright because there was nowhere to lie down, but summer brought its own horrors. The heat would cause corpses to bloat and explode, showering nearby positions with decomposed flesh. The smell during summer months was so intense that gas masks were sometimes worn just to breathe. Seventh, and this is something that haunted survivors for decades afterward, was the sound. The constant noise of artillery bombardments would continue for hours, sometimes days. Men would lose their hearing permanently, but even worse, they would develop what we now know as PTSD from the relentless noise. Soldiers described feeling like their brains were being scrambled inside their skulls. Some would rock back and forth uncontrollably, and others would simply stare into space, completely broken. But we're just getting started with the horrors that define daily life in these underground hellscapes. The eighth horror that soldiers faced was something called sapping warfare, and it was like fighting a war underneath a war. Engineers would dig tunnels beneath enemy trenches, pack them with explosives, and detonate them without warning. Imagine sitting in your trench, writing a letter home, when suddenly the ground beneath an entire section of your line just erupts into the sky, taking 50 of your friends with it. The explosion would create massive craters that both sides would then fight to control. But here's the truly terrifying part that most people don't know. Both sides were constantly listening for the sound of enemy digging. Specialized soldiers called listeners would press their ears to the ground or use primitive listening devices for hours at a time. When they heard digging, their own miners would try to intercept the enemy tunnel and engage in underground combat with picks, shovels, and pistols in complete darkness. These underground battles were some of the most savage fighting of the entire war. The ninth nightmare was the food, or what passed for food in the trenches. Rations were supposed to arrive daily, but supply lines were constantly under attack. When food did arrive, it was often contaminated by poison gas residue or crawling with maggots. Soldiers would eat hardtack biscuits that were so tough they had to be soaked in water for hours just to make them edible. The water itself was questionable at best, often drawn from shell holes that contained decomposing bodies. Men would develop severe dysentery and continue fighting while sick because there was nowhere to go. Some soldiers resorted to eating rats or anything else they could catch just to survive. But the 10th and perhaps most disturbing aspect of trench warfare was how it completely destroyed the concept of heroic battle that these men had grown up believing in. They had enlisted thinking they would charge gloriously across open fields with bayonets fixed, engaging in honorable combat with a visible enemy. Instead, they found themselves living like animals in holes in the ground, killing men they never saw with weapons that struck from miles away. Artillery shells would simply erase people from existence. One moment your friend would be standing next to you, the next moment there would be nothing left but a red stain on the trench wall. There was no honor in being killed by a shell you never saw coming, fired by someone you would never meet. The mental breakdown this caused was systematic and predictable. Soldiers would develop thousand-yard stares, unable to focus on anything. They would flinch violently at any sudden sound for the rest of their lives. Many would lose the ability to form emotional connections with other people because they had watched too many friends die in horrible ways. The military had no understanding of trauma back then, so soldiers who broke down mentally were often shot as deserters or cowards. What made it even worse was the randomness of death. Skill, courage, and training meant almost nothing when a shell could land anywhere at any time. The best soldier in your unit could be killed instantly, while the newest recruit survived unscathed. This randomness drove men to superstition and desperate attempts to find patterns where none existed. They would carry lucky charms, perform rituals, and develop obsessive behaviors, anything to feel like they had some control over their fate. The medical care available was primitive and often made things worse. Doctors had no antibiotics, no proper anesthesia for major surgery, and no understanding of infection control. Wounded soldiers would often die from infections that started in dirty field hospitals rather than from their original wounds. Amputation was the solution for almost any serious injury to arms or legs. The lucky ones died quickly from their wounds. The unlucky ones lingered for days or weeks before succumbing to infections or blood poisoning. Perhaps most horrifying of all was how normal this became for the men who survived long enough. After months in the trenches, soldiers would eat their meals while sitting next to corpses. They would sleep using dead bodies as pillows because the ground was too wet or cold. They would strip equipment and personal items from fallen enemies and allies alike without a second thought. The war had turned ordinary young men into something that barely resembled human beings anymore. So there you have it. 10 brutal realities of trench warfare that your history teacher probably never told you about. These weren't just soldiers fighting a war. These were human beings forced to live in conditions so horrific that they literally changed the structure of their minds and souls. When you see those old photographs now, you'll know that behind every face was someone who had experienced hell on earth and somehow found the strength to keep going. The next time someone talks about the glory of war or the honor of battle, remember what you've learned here today. Remember the rats, the smell, the random death, and the psychological torture that these men endured for years. They didn't fight for glory. They fought because they had no choice, and they survived because the alternative was even worse. These stories matter because the men who lived them deserve to be remembered for what they actually went through, not the sanitized version we're comfortable hearing. They faced horrors that most of us can't even imagine, and they did it so that future generations wouldn't have to. The least we can do is understand the true cost of what they sacrificed. If this opened your eyes to the real story of the Great War, there's so much more you need to know about the weapons and tactics that made this conflict the nightmare it became. Check out my video on the most terrifying weapons of World War I that will show you just how creative humans can get when it comes to destroying each other.